that really does mean a lot. But I think I appreciate you bringing Ashley's case to my attention for us to be able to do the show, because it's just another case, and it's the case that's at the forefront of missing and murdered Indigenous women and Indigenous people. And, I think her case highlights that. And I've been really impressed when I started researching it with all that Kimberly has done. It's incredible. And I think if I had anything to say, that's what stuck with me, is the work that Kimberly's done. And, she was there for Ashley in her life and was her support and had her back. And she still does to this day. And I do believe that someday Kimberly will bring Ashley home. She will. And I'm not saying anyone will necessarily be prosecuted, but I always have hope. I've seen so many cases that I thought were impossible to get solved. And so I have a lot of hope and faith, particularly with the fight that Kimberly has shown thus far and with all the people that she has gathered to support her, including yourself.
That's Julia Cowley, a retired member of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and the host of the Consult podcast. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. This is part 2 of a follow-up episode coming off of a 4-part series with Julia and her partners, 3 other retired FBI profilers. I wanted to revisit the case of Ashley Loring HeavyRunner with all of you. In the past, we've discussed it with Kimberly, Ashley's sister. We've also discussed it with Ashley's friend and relative, Haley Omeasoo, who went into forensic science because Ashley went missing. And it's been a reoccurring theme in my interviews with missing persons expert Ed Denzel, who's the host of the Unfound podcast, and geographic profiler Doug McGregor. In the first part, Julia and I discussed Ashley's case, how profiling can be utilized in missing persons cases, and the process that the profilers on the Consult utilize in looking into cases. We also talked about no-body homicides and a number of other topics. During that conversation, we discussed my appearance on the Consult in the 4-part series where we explored Ashley's case. In that series, we looked at the timeline of her disappearance, the victimology, and a lot of the context that, surrounded her. And we'll keep on discussing that this week. We talked about the process of criminal profiling, particularly in disappearances and no-body homicide cases. What I found really powerful was the surprising way that criminal profiling and the discussions separated the important details from the noise and brought a lot of clarity to some aspects of the case and how disappearances, really require you to look deeply at elements like victimology, the timeline, as well as the statistics. It really makes a difference. In part 1, we ended our discussion talking about the effortless lying by a suspect in Ashley's case, a 50-year-old man named Sam McDonald. And we also talked about a conversation last year that he had with me and Ashley's sister, Kimberly Loring. Sam is one of 3 primary suspects in the case, the others being Ashley's cousin, Tanisha Running Crane Eastwood. She's Ashley's cousin from her father's side of the family, and her husband, Paul Valenzuela, another suspect, may have been having a romantic relationship with Ashley. I traveled to Montana last summer, and one element of that conversation between Kimberly, Sam, and I, Julia and I were discussing at the end of part 1, and we were talking about his effortless lying. And Julia, I think that's a great place to pick back up this week.
And you have to remember that sometimes people who lie don't feel bad about it the way we do. Like there's no shame to it, or they don't feel bad when they're caught. And so we expect when someone gets caught in a lie, they're going to react a certain way because that's how we would react. We would be
sorry,
embarrassed or, stumbling. And then you have people that really, it doesn't bother them to get caught in a lie.
Keep on going.
Yeah. And we are just sort of just taken aback by that. Like, how do they just lie like that? And because they do not feel bad about it. And they lie with ease, they lie without remorse. And it can be hard to understand that.
Yeah.
We think they're going to have a certain reaction to being caught. Oh, gotcha. And then they're just going to give it all up. And it's like, no, they'll just go on to another lie. They don't care.
Yeah, because absence the actual content, just the way the conversation went, you would have thought that he had done nothing wrong, hadn't lied about anything, was just telling a story. And I was like,
yeah,
what is happening here?
Yeah.
And I mean, and that, to me, obviously, that it doesn't necessarily mean that someone is, committed a crime or done a crime. I mean, lying could just be their thing, or they could be a fabricator. But you would think, I mean, from my perspective, again, this is my bias and probably my own values driving this up, that if I were sitting in front of the family member of a victim, I think even if I had lied, I would do my best not to lie to them. But that's something, I guess, that's inside of me that's not inside of everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what you would do.
Yeah, that is what I would do. That is, in fact, what I would do.
You can't put yourself in someone else's shoes like that.
Yeah. No. But I guess the point that I think for me is it's hard to fathom this idea that there is no sort of like breaker on your lies that would cause you to go, okay, this has gone too far. Like, I am now.
Well, there is.
Yeah.
I think there's a breaking point for everybody at some point. And for some people, going back to what Bob said, when it no longer works for them, then they'll change. So there's always incentive to not lie. But what is that? It's different for each person.
Yeah.
Some is just, I feel bad when I lie, so I'm not going to lie. Or I want to tell the truth because I want to help solve this case and I want to bring Ashley home. And other people, nope, I had something to do with it. So I'm just going to keep up this lie until it no longer works. And I'll just make up another lie. So I think just every single person is different in each situation. And so we all have our breaking points about when we'll lie, when we won't lie anymore, those types of things. Some people, don't lie a lot. I mean, I think we all lie to some extent, no matter what.
We wear a mask, like just the mask we wear sometimes.
Yeah, we're all going to tell lies. But, like I remember when I was interviewed, my pre-polygraph employment interview, and they ask you all the questions before they actually give you your polygraph. But one of the questions, have you ever lied to a loved one? And I'm like, oh my God, where do I start? Oh no.
Do you mean today? I didn't see anyone this morning.
So like, what do you mean? Oh, and then I finally just, my answer ended up being, I've never told a lie that, people would never trust me again, or I would destroy relationships. I mean, I just had to really, answer like, yes, I've told lies.
Giving the most truthful answer, right? Yes.
I've never done, I've never told a lie that would, people would hate me for life or never trust me again, or I'd destroy somebody. Like, those are not the lies I tell. Like, no, that looks good on you.
Right. Yes.
No, it's beautiful. Love your hair color.
Looks great. The purple.
No, I mean, and then of course, lies I told as a kid to get out of trouble, things like that, So we all have our threshold of, what we're willing to lie about and what we're not willing to lie about, what lies make us feel bad, what lies don't make us feel bad. sometimes tell lies we don't even realize we're lying.
Mm.
We're just so used to telling that
A
lie.
certain story or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, no, how are you doing today? I'm great. Maybe I'm not great, but I'm
Right.
not gonna tell you why I'm
Yeah.
not great
Yeah. I'm not
today.
going to entertain that conversation. That
Yeah, that's why I
conversation
feel
about
bad
you
if
doing.
I avoid a situation and just, I don't wanna burden this person with why I'm not great today.
Yeah.
So, is that a lie I even think twice about? No, I don't.
Well, I can think of
But
one recently for me. I was very, very sick for a period of time, and one of my friends whose sister is dealing with serious medical issues called me because she knew I had been sick. And she called me and she's like, "How are you doing?" And I'm like writhing in pain on my couch. I'm like, "I'm great." Because I didn't want to burden her with, "You got her to worry about. Don't worry about
no, I'm
me."
fine. I can talk.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Go right ahead.
Barely, just keep on talking. Right.
Yeah.
A total side topic, sort of, but I wanted to bring this up. I mean, in the context of our episode, but also in the context of cases in general. One of the things that I know, and I'll just speak from my personal experience, that when I talk to people about cases, and I'm not thinking about my guests, but I'm thinking sometimes whether it's listeners or friends, they often feel like I'm a little cold when it comes to it. And I always tell them that, when you're looking at complicated situations, when you're looking at human behavior, you have to pull your own emotions out of it. And I know it's hard. This is a struggle for me in Ashley's case because very clearly my emotions are in this case, but I have to step away from them. And I have to try to see her realistically. I have to try to see her family realistically. And I even told myself going into this, looking into this case, if I come out in my head and there's any angel left, I haven't done enough work, right? So I have to look at everything really from this detached perspective. And then on occasion, I'll reattach, as I said. Um, and I think, we talked about this in your episode that sort of like everybody has their case. And I think Ashley's really become my case. Philip DiMartino is your case. But I think they're illustrative examples, I think, of the fact that s- it- stepping back and being clinical about a case does not mean that you don't care. It's just what you have to do if you want to try to get to an answer. And I think sometimes that's hard for people to understand. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, you have to have a balance.
Yeah.
I think that in order to do the work that we do and to do it well, we have to and to do the case justice to the victim, you have to be disciplined enough to not let emotion drive your conclusions. And that can be really hard. If you have, a ton of empathy for a victim, or you really empathize with them, or you really empathize with a victim's family member, or you really hate a suspect,
Hmm.
that can, you really have to remain objective. You can't let that emotion drive your conclusions. You will become biased. You really just have to detach. You have to be clinical. You have to be logical. That can be hard to do. There are times where I get pangs of emotion, but and obviously, there are cases like Philip's case where I know his sister and I feel for her because that is a case that I think is just on the cusp of being solved, but yet it's just not yet. And that just, I feel that of course, detached because, he's not my brother, but I feel for her and what she's going through. But I also have to remain, neutral about things.
Hmm.
And, luckily I've done the analysis that's done. So I don't,
Hmm.
my emotions are not relevant to his case anymore. But, you know, when you have that connection to a case because you've gotten to maybe know family members a little bit better, that's when your objectivity becomes even more important. And you can't, and the other thing is you can't let family members that you care about drive your conclusions
Yes.
either,
Yes.
because they may have a, and this, and I'm not saying this because this is not anything to do with Philip's case at all.
Mm-hmm.
Just generally, family members can try to drive the investigation, can try to drive your conclusions. They want it to be one person, or they want it to have one outcome. And if you become emotional about it, and it's the same thing, not just with family members, but with detectives that you're working with. If detectives feel really strong about a certain suspect and you get too caught up in that,
Mm-hmm.
or you want to make them happy,
Help validate them.
or validate them, or you want to avoid hurting somebody or crushing their
Mm-hmm.
theories or whatever, that you just have to be really careful. It's just really important that you block it all out. And that's when I always say you got to cut out all the noise.
Yeah.
You can't listen to what everybody's saying about, well, what about this, this, and this? You just have to block it out. What do I see? And be very logical about it. And you don't let your emotions come into play. You don't let it dictate your conclusions in any way, shape, or form. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have empathy. It doesn't mean, I have family, friends that I care so dearly about. And I can put myself in other people's shoes very easily. But when it comes to my work, I really have to step back and keep that emotion. Like when we did the Idaho 4 case, very difficult for me.
Yeah.
Because I think we've talked about this before, but when you have a case where you can really relate to the victims, having kids in college at the time, that I could really empathize. And as my kids get older, I might not feel that same pang about a case.
Mm-hmm.
But, when if I had a case with a child and my kid was that age, it's really difficult. So you really have to step back and separate that.
Yeah. And I feel that pull and I get that idea. And I in Ashley's case in particular, that I think getting to know the family, that's also been a very important part for me. That, I think in this particular case, they may have a certain set of opinions and that may not be stable, right? It might switch over time, but I don't really see my role the way that I've become a part of this. My role isn't to sort of like correct or push back necessarily on what their view is. I can respect that. I can take it into consideration. It can't drive what I think. In the same hand, as I research all these people and I find out all these details about their lives that are unbelievably shocking. It's amazing what you can find out about people, by the way. But, I'm not necessarily in love with everything that the victim's family has done, that the potential suspects have done. But this case, I think, is really instructive to that point about the perpetrators. Like, if I were picking a list of people I'd want to be friends with, or that I'd spend time with, or that I kind of would dislike, to me, it would almost be in the opposite order of the likely suspects. And it's kind of interesting. As I dig into their lives, I'm like, this is not an okay person. They're doing damage to the world. They're doing damage to their families. They're doing damage to this. But the evidence still doesn't line up. As much as I would love it to be this guy,
Mm-hmm.
as much as I think it would be great for society if this person were put away. But
it's like with your suspect, Paul.
Yeah.
Gosh, he's got such a criminal history. It's got to be him.
Yeah.
And if you were to just kind of go off emotion, yeah, he's number one suspect. Behaviorally, I don't think so. Stepping back and I don't know about that. And not only behaviorally, but just kind of on the circumstances didn't really line up for us to prioritize him as number one suspect. Certainly don't rule him out, but
Yeah.
But I think that's a good example about, would love for him to be him because he's a bad guy.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But I'm not seeing it with what we have at this point.
Yeah. And there's a part we didn't really talk about this just because it lines up with what you've seen, where I've looked into his life beyond the crimes and even incidents that other family members have been involved in crimes, including his son. Um, and the role that he's played in these different things, whether it's like his negligence as a dad, or, I've gotten insight from his interactions with law enforcement around those cases and all sorts of other things. And I'm like, this is not a good dude. And it would be so easy if I allowed my emotions to sort of overtake me. And we've talked about this before. I think one of the things about ethics, there are all these principles like conscientiousness and, having a clear sense of right and wrong and other elements. But I do think there's a place for our emotions to be compassionate, to do all these things. But when we have an objective task, it's you create ethical problems for yourself when you allow your emotions to sway you when it comes to an ethical task, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense.
Yeah. It's it's a delicate balance. One of the cool things I think in this case is I've had the chance, and I feel the same way about the Lewis Clark Valley serial killer case, and following that case. But I've had the opportunity to engage all sorts of interesting people. Doug McGregor, the geographic profiler that you had on and that I had on. What an amazing guy, truly amazing guy. Ed Denzel has also talked to me about the case, and I think I went on his podcast to talk about it at one point. But I've met human remains detection people, forensic scientists, investigators involved in the case, people who do search and rescue. People have touched the case that Tad brought up, Jermaine, and I got a chance to meet a bunch of people who worked that case from, search and rescue and human remains perspective. And, well, first of all, one thing I think about is it is really amazing how getting attention for this case has brought so many people out of the woodwork who want to help in some way, whether it's like people who want to volunteer to go search or these specialists. And, to me, it's just been really heartening. And I think we need it for a lot of cases, whether it's a missing murdered Indigenous woman or a case that's just not getting any attention anywhere. And I'm wondering, when you're thinking about a case like Ashley's or another missing persons case or someone, how can we bring all the disciplines together in sort of like a interdisciplinary perspective? I remember from my clinical days, we would pair therapists with psychiatrists, with social workers, with coaches, and we'd all bring different tools to the table to help the client, ultimately solve it. And I'm just wondering, where you think all of these different things can sort of fit together in a case like this.
Well, I think that multidisciplinary approach is really important in missing person cases because there's no one discipline that is going to have all the answers. And profiling or behavioral analysis is really just one piece of that. And it's really incumbent on the lead investigators to know what resources are out there because sometimes they don't. They're limited in their knowledge. Maybe they're a new investigator. They don't have a lot of resources. But there's so much available. And if they're just willing to look and to ask for assistance, and a lot will provide services for free.
Yeah.
Sometimes not, but you can always find those people really willing to help. But search and rescue teams, forensic scientists, and that's available if they don't have the resources. Maybe their state does. Maybe there are federal resources they can ask for. Human remains special or detection specialists, and bring out, people that have dogs that can do searches if they have a location, and, digital experts. So, but again, it's kind
Yeah.
of incumbent on this lead investigator to pull these resources. And as you mentioned earlier this evening about people being reluctant to ask for help, but you have to. And behavioral analysis is just another discipline to draw upon. And if we were involved and these other specialists were not, we would recommend that. We often recommend, oh, have you talked with this particular unit? Have you talked with this expert? We always will recommend that if that is something that hasn't been done or a resource that an agency doesn't have. But they all look at the case from a different perspective.
Yeah.
And with behavioral analysis, we are looking at the patterns and the behavior, and that's just that's can be useful, but it's such a small piece of the investigation.
The broader elements, and
Yeah.
yeah.
And the other disciplines, a lot of the other disciplines are the ones that really can gather the evidence that you would bring to trial. BAU is not, we might be able to, again, recommend some experts, but you're not going to call us in and we're going to go into court and solve the case. It's going to be these other disciplines that do that. The experts in digital evidence, the human remains detection specialists, the the investigators that have conducted the interviews, right, the polygraphers, all of that. So I think bringing all these disciplines together, you really start to maybe narrow down the possibilities and getting closer to the truth.
I imagine some of it is that for some investigators, you may not know the resources, or you may only go to an in-service or a training and find out about them. But I do think some of it's exactly what you said. Sometimes it's just really hard to ask for help, particularly in certain professions where you have this idea in your head, like, I need to crack this, or I need to solve this. But I do agree with you. Like, it can be... it can, when you bring together, whatever you're doing, when you bring together a bunch of different disciplines, it just can have this exponential power. One of the things I was thinking about, and we've talked about this before, that, and you kind of alluded to this before, you don't call BAU for like every garden variety crime, right? Like we caught the guy on videotape doing it and all that. We probably don't need behavioral analysis. You guys might find it interesting, but we probably don't need to do it. And I like to say BAU is designed for the 1% cases, right? The ones that weren't caught on videotape, aren't easy to solve, aren't bank robberies, which are always caught on videotape. And that, missing persons cases are just some of the most difficult ones. You, Angela, Susan, Bob, you guys, with retired Minneapolis Police Sergeant Holly Kegel, you guys explored that March 1969 case of William Campbell Underhill. He was a University of Minnesota student who disappeared. And I think that may have been the first or one of the first missing persons cases I listened to you guys do. And that case just really, 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 really stuck in my head. And, long-term disappearances, I was looking at the stats recently, and what was it? It was something like, I forget, it was some very high percentage were solved within the first few days, first few weeks. It was like 80-something% were solved within a month, and only 1% were missing over a year. And it really is like a lot, even though they get lots of media attention, they're like super rare. And I just felt it was really interesting to see you guys go all the way back to 1969 to explore that case. How did that become a case for you guys? And tell me about that process and that one.
Yeah. So Holly Kegel, she's retired from the Minneapolis Police Department, and she and her sister are working for the family for free. This is what she's doing in her retirement, and she took on this case and heard about our show and listened to our show and brought the case to us to talk about on the show. And that case is extremely difficult because it does go back to 1969, and there was a delay in the investigation, and all the problems you would think you would have, this case had. And disappearances are difficult anyway, but it was also trying to narrow down, did he walk off because he didn't want to go to Vietnam? That was a possibility. We, in looking at everything, we didn't think that was what happened, but that was definitely a possibility for him. Did he take his own life? He had mental health issues. He had attempted to take his life in the past, but it was not successful, let's say, but it was, I don't want to say it wasn't serious, because I think any attempt is serious. You take it seriously. But so we had to examine that as a real possibility. Did he meet with an accident because he left a party? Was he drinking? Did he fall into some water somewhere because there were bodies of water? Or did he meet with foul play? And so we were examining everything, and there really wasn't a ton of evidence to necessarily point us in any direction. I think we leaned toward possible foul play because there were some maybe things in his victimology that perhaps could have been further explored. But I think at least one of us had also, a stronger leaning toward he possibly took his life.
Nice. Yeah.
So we left that case with some ideas for Holly and her sister to follow through on. But it's in a case like that's so old. They did so much research too. They got old maps and went back. You really have to kind of put yourself back in that day and age and what was available, what life was like, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I love those kinds of cases because there's kind of a history.
You have to go to another world almost.
Yeah. But you spend a lot of time just trying to verify the facts and separate those from assumptions, and then evaluate what explanations best fit with what we know. It was a tough case. I feel like that was a case we sort of just really, we gave some investigative suggestions, but I don't think we had a real strong leaning toward one thing other than we didn't think he ran off to Canada. Accident, maybe. Took
Always
his life,
possible.
maybe. Foul play, maybe. And yeah. And I think the family feels that he might have taken his life.
It's life. That's the way they
Yeah. So I think to hear, well, we still think there's some investigation that needs to be done to at least try to rule out the foul play. I think that was a little jarring for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they had kind of one, and they gave approval for Holly to come on the show. So this was no surprise, but I think it was kind of like, something we've kind of
held for decades as the
settled in our minds as what possibly happened. They just want to find him, and I think they do want answers, and they want to bring him home. But I think they kind of settled on he likely took his own life. And to hear, well, let's look a little further down these avenues was maybe hard to take, and I understand why.
One of the cases that I think is a good example of, one of those probably nobody homicides or missing persons cases where it's a little bit more obvious a crime occurred, and I haven't hadn't even really thought of this in the context of it, but the Jody Huisentruch case that you
Yes.
guys explored. I mean, to me, that's another great example of where profiling can actually help in a missing persons case. Because, I felt listening to your episodes, exploring those, a lot of the things, that I think you'd naturally gravitate to if you just read that case blindly. It kind of, you know, in a weird way, you guys poured cold water on the idea that we could have a suspect easily. But I felt like that was another powerful example because you really looked through her life, her behaviors, her interactions with people, and then what happened that morning. And that seemed to be a case that you really, I guess, enjoyed is the wrong word. It's a hard word to use with this. But I think that, you know, you guys seem to get a lot out of that case and a lot of really interesting ideas. How did you end up exploring that case? And, what was the process like there? I knew you had the help of the wonderful Carolyn Lowe, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So, yeah, Caroline had reached out. She heard our show, and Caroline is a dogged crime reporter who has been covering Jody's case for many, many years. And this is her case, just like you and I, we talked about our cases. This is a case that is very near and dear to Caroline's heart. And so she brought it to us. And so she'd originally talked to me, and I just gave her sort of my initial impressions, and she sent me stuff to read, and I watched different documentaries, and 48 Hours, I think, covered it as well at some point many years ago. But I pulled up the old episodes, and John Van Cise, who was Jody's older male friend, it was a main suspect, and I think he's since passed away, but probably still remains the main suspect. And just at the time, kind of the cursory look that I was taking and talking with Caroline, I'm like, I don't think this doesn't fit for me that he did this. And I had my reasons. It wasn't just, oh, he just doesn't fit. I mean, it was a behavioral thing that, I was thinking. And then eventually, when we started the show back up, I invited Caroline to come on. She knows more about the case than just about anybody other than maybe the lead detective.
Maybe.
So
Maybe.
well,
Right.
maybe.
Right. Maybe.
I mean, she's always saying, maybe I don't know this. And maybe it's, and I'm like, no, you know.
No, Right.
You have that information. She has uncovered so much about it. So she came on the show, and I had talked with her off the show, off the record, about what my impressions were. And so, but I said, but let's do the consult and see what my colleagues think, because they might not think like I do, and they'll have some ideas of their own. We all came to the same conclusion looking at the same evidence. We did not believe John Van Cise. And this is not groupthink. This is sort of our independent look at the case, which really validated what I was thinking. But none of us think John Van Cise is responsible for her disappearance. It made no sense behaviorally going through the case. And I think that case also is a really interesting case. There's no doubt in that case there's foul play. There is almost no doubt that Jody's no longer alive. Her family had her declared dead several years ago. And so that makes it different. Like, we don't have to guess there's foul play. There was a lot of evidence to suggest there was foul play involved. But our look at it, and oftentimes we don't always go down the suspect rabbit hole, but he was a main suspect,
right?
And we had to discuss him.
Well, you guys didn't go all the way down the suspect rabbit hole in that case, because there's some pretty wacky theories about.
Yeah, there's a lot
suspects.
of different theories, and and in looking at her victimology, she was a high-profile person in this area, and we really thought that was her greatest risk. The other thing about it was really going back to her victimology is that, if you look at this at a surface level, she was 27 years old. John Van Cise was 49 years old. There was no romantic relationship between the two of them, although people would suggest there might have been, or they suggest that, well, he was infatuated with her but when you look at the type of person she was very genuine. Her former boss, described her as just being one of the most genuine people. Like, doesn't lie. She doesn't lead people on. Talking with some of her friends about the relationship with John Van Cise. And I just don't think people gave her enough credit. She wasn't going to be hanging out with somebody who made her uncomfortable. And that was not her personality. She did what she wanted to do. She might have had this bubbly personality, and she really was. She was a friendly, bubbly person, but she was also a very strong young woman who was very independent, knew what she wanted, was going for it in life. And I do not believe she would have had a friendship with John Van Cise if that friendship was not healthy,
comfortable and healthy for her.
She
would have set a boundary. Yeah.
Yes. And she did set boundaries with him.
Right.
They had gone away the previous weekend. And Jody had friends with her, and Jody and her friends stayed in one room, and John's in another. They were not in a relationship, and John didn't push that. Although I think everyone does believe, and I do too, if he had an opportunity to date her, he might have.
Right.
I don't think any man wouldn't want to date her. She just seemed, she's a great catch.
Yeah.
So that was something that I really felt, at the end of it, clarity for me. Like, I don't think he did it. But that makes the case more difficult.
Yes. Yes. And I think that's the thing about looking at these things objectively. You have to realistically know, like, even thinking about a case like this, like Ashley's, I can spend years investigating it and actually come out with like a conclusion that is less satisfying, as in, in theory, you could investigate a case long enough and knock out all the suspects. you could, and you may actually come up with a less satisfying answer to things. You mentioned something just a second ago about you guys on that case, and the same thing on the Underhill case. And I had always noticed, in listening to the podcast, you guys are, to me, clearly not scripted, but I think people sometimes think that hosts on podcasts like that come up with their conclusions beforehand and then go through the process. But it was very obvious to me that you guys were coming up with your questions on the fly, coming in with your conclusions in the moment. And it was really interesting to watch. And I was wondering, was that a window into what a real BAU consult is like? It was really interesting to be a part of it. I'm just wondering how realistic it is compared to sort of the way that, the consults that you, Bob, Susan, and Angela would do. And
it's very realistic.
Okay.
It's not scripted. The only thing that's scripted is when I do like a case summary at the beginning, which would be very similar to the summary I would give in a BAU report. So I write it out like I would write out a report. On this date, the victim was found here, blah, blah, the circumstance, all the relevant circumstances to tell the story. That's the only part that I script out beforehand. But we have our process. We talk about the crime, what our impressions are, and we get into victimology. As you noticed, when we did Ashley's case, people jump into victimology sometimes too soon.
Bob.
Angela did too. But in a real consult, we may jump around like that. But for the show, I kind of like to keep it a little more structured. But like I said, there's nothing, we may, before we record an episode, there may be some questions like people have just generally about the case. Like, somebody might say, well, so-and-so clearly did it, and I'm just giving it. I'm like, well, we'll get to that, But it's, we don't talk that much about it beforehand. I gather material, I send it to everybody. They may do their own research as well on top of that. And we all come having, read mostly all the same things or watched the same things if there's interviews we need to watch or transcripts we need to read. And we go through it like a real consult is. And that's when I started the show, how it was going to be. We're just going, and in some of the cases that that are already solved, we'll just talk generally about certain concepts. And, as we have upcoming episodes on Rex Heuermann and what his interviews with the BAU will be like, just generally. So we have those episodes coming up, but everything is very authentic.
Yeah.
Which is why sometimes it seems a little unstructured because we do jump around or we circle back.
Right.
And there's also things that I'm learning as I go along with the show that maybe I take for granted that a listener should know.
Yep.
And, my husband who listens to the show will point out, not all of us know this. So it'd be better if you explained it a little more what that means. In a real consult, I wouldn't have to do that.
Right.
But he's absolutely right. There may be things that we just know because of our experience.
Investigators would know it
and that we don't necessarily need to talk about, but I need to explain it to a listener that may not be in law enforcement. It's the same thing in any discipline. If you're in the medical field or you're an attorney,
we start to skip a lot as we're talking.
Right. So I've tried to get better at that, to kind of explain things and then re-explain things, because sometimes I think, not every listener has heard every episode.
Right.
So, we may have a discussion in victimology early on in our series. Well, every time we revisit it, especially when we have victims that might be at a higher risk or marginalized victims, we explain once again what victimology is and what it isn't designed to do, and how important that it is into understanding the case. So those are types of things. Again, if a listener hasn't listened to all our episodes, they might think, well, this sounds like victim blaming.
Yeah. I love that spontaneous explanation you gave during the episode where you were like, it's not about what's wrong with the victim. It's about what's wrong with them, the suspect, and that caused them to gravitate toward this person.
Yeah, exactly. What kind of person are we looking at that would, like you said, gravitate toward or select this victim? It's more of a judgment on the offender than it is on a victim. But it's so key. And that, in a consultation, in a real consultation with detectives, you don't have to be cognizant that family members are listening.
Right.
Or the public.
Right.
And so we all understand in a consultation the importance of victimology and being very candid and frank about it. What are the risks here? And when you're delivering that to the public, you have to do it in a different way.
Slightly different way, with more caveats or explanations of what you're doing.
Right. Yeah. And I am learning that as I go along, providing more explanations to things that I wouldn't necessarily do in a consult, and trying to keep it a little more structured. Actually, the show is probably a little more structured than a real consult is. In a real consult, we do jump around a lot, and we may, but we try to keep it case summary, victimology, observations, kind of like that, depending on if there's an autopsy, medical findings, forensic findings, all of that comes at the beginning, and then a deep dive into the victimology.
I appreciate the methodology.
Very realistic.
Yeah, I appreciate the methodology because I think, at least for me, it puts it into buckets that you can kind of understand, almost building blocks. And I could understand how for you guys in a real consult, all those things can cross over. And but it makes the logic plain, the way that you have it organized, the way you walk through the victimology, and then your observations about things, and then the next piece of it. And I just have an appreciation. And I think, it's weird, Julia. I think part of the reason why I can be so objective and clinical about these things is because of how much I care about them, that I really do want, like in Ashley's case or similar ones, Jody's case is another example. I do want them to be brought home. And like, I know my tears in a cup are not going to bring them home, but the best part of all of our minds and our thoughts and our approaches, and I just feel like you guys use a methodology that can actually, here's the thing, I think it can empower law enforcement, but it can also empower lay people to find ways to contribute or help out too, or family members. And I think that structure helps, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I really
Yeah.
do like that.
I need to have it structured a certain way and for my thinking about it. And as I explained earlier, to make certain that I'm not swayed or biased by certain things.
Yeah.
Like I really need to look at the crime itself, free from victimology, and then add in victimology. And then potentially, if there are suspects to prioritize, then that comes in at the last minute. Because if you start with a suspect, and then you're
in trouble. And I know that's what people want
trouble.
to do. That makes a good story. It really does. But
Can't start with the suspect because everything from there will be tainted. You really just have to block that out. And, so.
Well, one of the interesting things about not starting with a suspect, and you're exploring a person's life pre the suspect, and then when the suspect enters the story, it can be really stark. You can see sort of shifts that make you go, once this character enters this story, it starts to get a little weird, or other pieces like that. And I think if you start with the suspect, you run into too much risk of confirmation bias or too much risk of.
So.
Yeah. I wanted to. I could keep you here all night, but I wanted to go ahead and give you a chance if you have any sort of closing thoughts. I love that. I love the opportunity to be on the show to talk about this case because I care about it, but also because I think it was really such a powerful examination of it. And what I told Kimberly was, I don't think I've heard anyone talk about this case this way in such a smart way. And I do think it's unique in the sort of pantheon of things that have, NBC has covered her case, ABC has covered her case, there have been podcasts about it. But I honestly think this is the best and most thorough discussion on your podcast about it. And so I think that's a gift. And I really do appreciate that. And I'm glad you could come on so we could talk about the topic, the case, and, how profiling can be used in missing persons cases. But I wanted to go ahead and throw it to you for any closing thoughts that you have.
Well, I appreciate that quite a bit. That means a lot to me and makes it all worthwhile doing the show because I do want to have productive shows that provide clarity, that move things forward, even if just a little bit. That's really important to me, and to educate people and to continue learning myself from the people that make me better at my job, which are my colleagues, Angela, Susan, and Bob. No three better people to work with. Well, there's one more I can think of, but she's not on the show yet. Still trying to talk her in. Another BAU person. But so that really does mean a lot. But I think I appreciate you bringing Ashley's case to my attention for us to be able to do the show, because it's just another case, and it's the case that's at the forefront of missing and murdered Indigenous women and Indigenous people. And, I think her case highlights that. And I've been really impressed when I started researching it with all that Kimberly has done. It's incredible. And I think if I had anything to say, that's what stuck with me is the work that Kimberly's done. And she was there for Ashley in her life and was her support and had her back. And she still does to this day. And I do believe that someday Kimberly will bring Ashley home. She will, and I'm not saying anyone will necessarily be prosecuted, but I always have hope. I've seen so many cases that I thought were impossible to get solved. And so I have a lot of hope and faith, particularly with the fight that Kimberly has shown thus far and with all the people that she has gathered to support her, including yourself. So thank you very much for allowing us to have a conversation about the case.
Yeah, I really appreciate it, all of that. And I just appreciate the time and the opportunity. Well, thanks for coming on again, Julia. See you again. In CrimeCon momentarily.
Yeah, just a few weeks away.
Just a few weeks away.
I'm
looking forward to it.
I keep announcing it on the show, and pretty soon I'm not going to be able to anymore because it'll be over. I'm really looking forward to it. I had my last year I went for the first time, and it was extremely rewarding for me. So I'm looking forward to it. All 4 of us will be there, so that makes it even more meaningful for me to have my team there.
That will be awesome. That'll be neat. I think a lot of people, there might be some, people go to CrimeCon for assortment of reasons, but I think, I think it can be surprising for people how productive it can be and how interesting it can be and how worthwhile it can be. It's one of those things that I'm glad it's around. I'm glad it's around for victims. I'm glad it's around for creators and advocates and, or even just what I learn about science in, a different CrimeCon event, or I do love that part of it. So I will see you soon, my friend.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for joining Julia and I today for the second part of our 2-part series on the case of Ashley Loring HeavyRunner and also how profiling can be utilized in missing persons cases. Before I go, I want to make a quick announcement. Over the coming weeks, I am going to be taking some time off. So we are going to have a break in episodes. We're about 200 plus episodes in, and I need a little time to work on a couple other projects. So in the time between now and probably August, we'll move to a schedule of once every other week, and then we'll be back for weekly episodes after that. First, I want to thank you all for just being dedicated listeners over these 200 plus episodes, and I appreciate each and every one of you. If you want to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. And we'll see you guys all again soon.
You can't predict the future, but you can prepare for it. Arizona State University is building degrees for what's ahead. Programs designed around emerging fields, taught by faculty whose research is shaping our future, not just teaching about it. It's why we've been ranked #1 in innovation for more than a decade. Your future is worth preparing for, and you don't have to prepare alone. Future-proof your career. Explore more than 350 programs at asuonline.asu.edu. That's a degree better.